Hi everybody, hope you had a good week. Thanks for tuning in. Welcome back to Engine Shop Joe. Today we are going to talk about a tractor that was sent to the engine shop to be evaluated, and they wanted us to comment on the engine, and then we take pictures of the chassis and the frame and send them to the appropriate person with our estimate of what it's going to cost to put the engine back into shape so that it can go back into the fleet and run for, say, at least 3 or 4 years without any engine work. So this particular truck had a deep reduction transmission, and it had 2-speed rear ends. It was one of the early on heavy haulers. It was a 4-axle tractor. It was a Peterbilt. Nice truck, really. And it was a 2000 and I think the year model was 10, but the engine was a 2009. So it was an 871 600 horsepower, and it was 1,850 foot-pounds of torque. So the first thing I look at is the image. So let's take a look at the image and go from there. So one of the first things that I always look at is the audit trail, actually, to see how many times they've reset fault codes. And you'll see a yellow bar there that says reset fault codes. And this one is we're going to get good information out of this image because the last time anybody reset fault codes was 2,993 hours ago. So any faults that are in there have been in there for a while. So I'll be able to get a good idea from the faults what if anything's going on. So let's go take a look at the faults. Here's our list of faults. First thing we're going to do is look at the far right column at the timestamps for the faults. And there's some faults in there that have 1,600 hours on them. So I know they haven't been clearing faults over and over and over. We just looked at the audit trail, and that confirmed this, that whoever owned this hasn't been clearing faults every month or every 2 weeks, and that does happen. If the oldest fault on here was that 10-hour one, the audit trail would have been very important, because I've seen audit trails where in 400 hours they've erased faults 8 different times, about every 60 hours. So something's going on, they just keep erasing faults and driving it normally when you see something like that. And then it makes it harder to evaluate what's really going on unless I have an older image, 5 or 7 images back where they maybe had some faults in there that they deleted that I could at least see. So here, turbocharger turbine intakes a little bit high. That's not a big deal. I'll talk about that in another video. We go down the list, and then we've got exhaust gas bank pressure 1. This only has one exhaust gas pressure sensor because there's only one bank or one side of the engine. V8s have 2 banks. I should say V12s or V16s have 2 banks. They don't make a V8 anymore. They did have a nice one that went in a Nissan, but they quit making it. So you're going to see in a little bit that the fault code 2373 and 2374 exhaust gas bank pressure is reflecting a problem, even though the fault was 274 hours old the last time it logged. And then crankcase pressure faults come on. That always concerns me because this is data erratic, intermittent, or incorrect. So that either means the sensor was it's a vague fault. Sensor sending the wrong signal. Intermittent. Sometimes the sensor, the O-ring on that sensor starts to leak in the plastic housing and the pressure's spiking up and down. Sometimes a wasp will get up into a mud wasp especially, get up into the blow-by tube if the truck sits for weeks at a time, and they'll build a nest up in there, and that'll cause a crankcase pressure problem until they find it and blow it out. So all in all, this doesn't look too bad. Okay, there's nothing here I see that's really a big flag that there's a big problem with the engine. So let's move on now. Okay, we're going to take a look at regen history now. This is an ISX 871, And I've talked enough times on this channel about regens and ISX 871s. So you guys tell me what the time between previous regeneration should be if the engine's healthy. That's right. It should be 30 to 35 hours. What do we have here? 97 to 98 hours average between regens. You might say that's wonderful. If you look over to the far right, look how high the differential pressure is. It should be down around 2.1 to 2.5. At the very last regen up there, it was 4.4. And notice where it's 4.4, look over to the left, and you'll see that diesel particulate filter intake temperature is 1119, and the outlet's 1061. I should say the inlet temperature is 1119, and the outlet's 1061. Well, that's not possible. So there's probably something going on with the outlet temperature sensor. There might be a ball of soot stuck or a melted portion in a DPF so that the air can't flow right over that. Because in general, if you look down the list, the outlets for the last three regens, the outlet temperature started dropping way below the inlet temperatures, and that's not normal. So of course, I went and looked at the exhaust stack, and it's coal black. So I know that the filter is breached, and even though the filter is breached, it's cracked enough, it's catching soot. I also know the engines might be running a little dirty. Remember, the 871 has mechanical injectors. Now, trivia question for those of you who were paying attention. In our last slide, I didn't mention it. What was the total hours on this engine? It was in the last slide. If you don't know, go back and take a look. And now you know. So we got to keep total hours in mind when we're deciding what it's going to cost to rebuild this. Now, so I don't get too winded, we're going to go to the snapshot of the sensor, monitoring of sensors, key on, engine off. So that happens when you take the ECM image. Always take an ECM image with the engine off so you can see what the sensor static values are. Look down at exhaust gas pressure. It's 33.87. It should be 29.8 or 29.9. That's what our barometric pressure is, where this truck was at when we took the image. So the exhaust gas pressure sensor is way off. That affects, running across the whole gamut of the engine's RPM range. So that would be something that would definitely have to be replaced. In fact, I'm surprised it didn't log an active fault for exhaust gas pressure while the engine was running. So the last part of the equation of checking an engine out, listen to how it runs. You take into account the type of injectors it has. This has mechanical injectors. So each injector in this engine, if we had to replace it, would be about $688, I think, our cost. And if it had an electronic injector in it, it would be about $1,100 each, our cost. So 6 injectors is $6,000. A head for that engine's $3,500. And I'm talking about dealer level pricing. I'm not talking about retail. So we look at that. Physically, the engine, the gasket on the flywheel housing was leaking, and the gasket on the front gear housing was leaking. That means the hood had to come off, the radiator and all that came out. The engine got stripped down to the front of the block bare, the whole gear train comes off. And then once that's fixed, the transmission comes out, the flywheel housing comes off, and that gets done. But it's got 18,000 hours on it. So there you go. That, if you went back and looked, it's got 18,000 hours. It's never had injectors. It's never had a head. It's had one turbo, so it's probably going to need a turbo. The turbo's $6,900 without the VGT, I believe, the last time we bought one. because the older 871 turbos are getting harder to find. So you add all that up, we figured to rebuild this engine at our cost, it was going to be close to $39,000. And that's just too much. So because the engine would have had to come out, we tear it down to nothing, tank everything, clean everything. So it would be an 80 hours of labor in there. And then with all the parts we'd put in, because when we're done, for all intents and purposes, it's a factory rebuilt engine. That'll run 1,000,000 miles. But the truck that it was in wasn't going to make it another 1,000,000 miles. So this one goes to auction as is. Thanks for joining me. See you next time on Engine Shop Joe.